what got you into drawing? I mean, that's got to be the starting point.
As soon as I could pick up a pencil, I was putting marks on paper.
Okay.
Like 2 years old. And I got so into it that we started running out of paper. So my sisters would give me their homework assignments.
Yeah.
And after they were graded, and I would draw on the backs of those. And then I started wanting a bigger, like a bigger format. I started seeing sequences, like my mom, after she'd go shopping, you know, those big brown paper bags, like you used to get.
Yeah.
She would cut those around the edges and make me a long piece of paper like that.
Okay.
So I used to draw on the.
And were these characters, or were just?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like cars, a lot of cars.
Okay.
And scenes of like spaceships attacking people. And I used to sit down in front of the television when we had, you know, this was in the 60s, so I would watch like Johnny Yuma or Paladin, or I was really into westerns. And I would try to draw the sequences that I was seeing on the screen, like as the story would progress.
Okay.
I would draw like the cowboys and whatever they were doing. So I wish I still had some of those.
Yeah, that would be
Long
cool.
gone, yeah.
So, did you read a lot of comic books when you were young?
Yeah. My initially, when we would my cousins, I had a lot of older cousins, and our families were very close. So when we would visit my uncles and aunts, I was really intensely hyperactive kid. I'm like 98th percentile ADHD. So they found out that if they got a big stack of comics and put them in front of me, they wouldn't have to worry about me for about an hour. So I would sit in my cousins' rooms and I would look at their comic book collections. And so that's how I first turned on to the comics. When it was time for me to go to grade school, we didn't have kindergarten. I grew up in West Virginia. I didn't go to kindergarten. So I started out in the first grade. And my dad was walking me to first grade, and I was terrified because I didn't know what to expect. And so we passed by this barber shop, and at that time, barber shops used to have a lot of comic books for kids.
Okay.
You know, sit there and read before they get their hair cut. And laying on the windowsill, I saw this Our Fighting Forces comic. It was an old war comic from the 60s. And I just stopped because it had two GIs on the cover, you know, in the Pacific, and they had this big white German Shepherd dog. And, you know, so that was on the cover, and it just captivated me. And I just stopped crying, and I stopped and looked at that for a long time. And so finally my father nudged me along, and I went to first grade. And I just had a terrible day. I did not like school. I never liked school. And so whenever Dad got home that evening, he asked me how my day had gone. And so I told him, you know, very tearfully. And he gave me that comic. He'd gone back to the barber shop and he'd talked the barber out of the comic.
Oh, wow.
And he gave me that comic book. So that was the very first comic book in my collection.
Do you still have it?
Yeah, it's downstairs.
Oh, that's cool. What other comics were you interested in? Were there characters that you were really drawn to?
Yeah, I liked the old war comics. And there was a comic book called Kona, Monarch of Monster Isle. And he was like this blonde caveman guy. In the modern day, they discovered this lost island, and he was running around on this island with all these dinosaurs. It was kind of like Skull Island with, you know, King Kong. And I loved that comic, and I loved the artwork in it. Later on, I got to work with the artist of that comic, he became a real hero of mine, Sam Glanzman. And unfortunately, Sam just passed away yesterday.
Oh, wow.
But he was 92 years old.
Okay.
But I had the opportunity to work with him, you know, after I'd grown up, you know,
yeah.
when I was like in my 40s. And Sam and I became great friends. But he was an early influence on me. Then later on, I got into like Fantastic Four and Thor and Captain America, and I liked the Marvel comics at that point better than the DC comics.
Who doesn't?
Yeah.
Right?
That was before the DC kind of revamped their stuff, you know. The DC stories of, you know, like Batman and Superman and that were always kind of milquetoast to me, you know. I thought they were too watered down, but when you saw Jack Kirby draw superheroes, it was like Jack Kirby's famous motto was, "I don't draw slingshots, I draw cannon." And you know, he really went for the, you know, really went for the throat. His work had a lot of gusto and it was really stylized.
Okay.
Another thing that was a real big influence too was every Sunday we'd get the newspaper, and my dad would like read the sports section or whatever, but he would hand the comic pages off to me, you know, the full color comic page.
Yeah.
So I would get into like Prince Valiant and the Phantom, and my big favorite was Dick Tracy, Chester Gould's Dick Tracy. And at that point it was, you know, they had all these stories about moon men, and you know, they're just wacky, crazy stories, but I loved Chester Gould's art style. It was really sort of off-kilter. It wasn't realistic. It was extremely stylized, but there was just something that really attracted me to it.
Okay.
You know.
So what was your first paying gig as an artist?
Oh my gosh. My first paying gig was, I had done little works. I went to the Joe Kubert School in New Jersey, and it was Joe Kubert School of Cartoon and Graphic Art. And it was the first comic book school in the United States. So I went for my first interview there, I think in '77, and then I finally got to become a student. It was a 3-year class. I was there from late '78 to the middle of 1981. That's when I graduated. During that time, I'd done these work study assignments. Joe had a contract with Scholastic magazine to do like little 4 or 6 page comics, and he let me do one of those. We only got paid like $30 a page or something like that.
Okay.
But and then also he was an editor with DC Comics at the time, so he would he talked them into letting students do backup stories, 2, 4, 6 page backup stories in the Sergeant Rock magazine. And so that was my first published work, and you know, like I say, it was like $25 a page or $30 a page at that point. But I was the only married student in the school at the time, so Beth and I needed money, and so I started going, during my second year of school, I started going outside the school and looking for work, and which Joe actually frowned on, the Joe Kubert, who owned the school.
Okay.
But I had to do it. We needed some money.
What'd you find?
And I went to a magazine called Creative Computing Magazine in Morristown, New Jersey, and that was my first real paying gig. Was doing this little. My first cover was for them. I had learned from one of my instructors at school that whenever you turn in an assignment, take in an idea for another job. So I followed his advice, and I did my first published comic book work for them as well. It was the early days of computing, so there was this little, it was like one of the first personal computers called Sync, and it probably had like 5 megabytes of memory or something. But it was the first, you know, one of the first personal computers, and they had a magazine dedicated to it. So I did a comic strip, a science fiction comic strip called Crash Cursor and Sync, which was a takeoff on Flash Gordon. Okay. And so I think I did 3 installments of that, and they paid me pretty good money, you know. Yeah. So that was my first paying gig while I was in school. I graduated in '81, and my first like postgraduate work was with, the week before graduation, I had sent out like 10 portfolios, and I'd gotten a call back from a gaming company in New York City called SPI Games, and they did role-playing games and strategy games. And they had a magazine called Aries. And so my first work was for this Aries magazine, and I did comics in there. I did a few covers. I did some cover art for some strategy games that they put out, and that was my first paying stuff.
Is that what led to TSR?
Yeah, it was exactly what led to TSR. The Dungeons and Dragons people. TSR actually bought SPI Games when they went out of business. I worked with SPI for about a year. They went out of business. TSR bought them, and I got a call from some editors that I'd worked with who TSR had hired, and they had, they were the SPI editors. TSR had hired a few of the editors, and I got a call from them to see if I would be interested in working for Dungeons and Dragons. Initially as the art director for Dragon Magazine, doing art every day for 8 hours.
Okay.
And doing it, specifically to cater to an editor or a committee of editors, which was always a nightmare. And,
yeah,
but it taught me a lot.
That led me to, like, did you enjoy that work?
No.
No. Okay.
No, I didn't. Like I say, I'm intensely hyperactive, so just the fact that I had to sit at a desk in an office, and the building had no windows, and I loved the guys I worked with. I mean, I met my best friend ever there, Keith Parkinson, and I worked with Larry Elmore and Jeff Easley and a few other really amazing artists like that. And I loved working with them, but I just hated clocking in at 8 o'clock in the morning and then clocking out at 4 or 5 in the evening.
Okay.
And it just, like, I usually start working at about 11 or 12, I'm a really slow wake up. And then I like to work after dinner. I like to go back into the studio and do some more work. And that's just my natural clock, is to do that. I wasn't comfortable in that environment. Also working with some of the editors was kind of tough.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of politics.
So where did Grimjack come in then?
There was while I was working at TSR, which is in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin.
Okay.
Chicago's only like an hour south. Lake Geneva is where all these millionaires from Chicago went while their houses were being rebuilt after the Chicago fire. They went and built mansions around the lake at Lake Geneva.
Okay.
So it became like this tourist community, like in later years. And that's where TSR was headquartered. Some friends had been going to a Sunday, every month, one Sunday each month, there was a little comic book convention that was held in the basement of a hotel in Chicago. And I had friends that went to it, and at that point the independent comics movement was just starting. And they said, hey, there's this new publisher, First Comics, and they've been having a table there at this convention every Sunday, and you ought to go down and show some of your stuff to them. You love comics so much. And so I got a portfolio together, and sure enough, met the guys at First Comics, and they looked through my portfolio, and I didn't draw superheroes and stuff. Even though I read them when I was a kid, I like more adventure-oriented stuff and science fiction-oriented stuff. And I just happened to have all these illustrations that I've been doing, sort of science fiction mercenaries and all these science fiction scenes. And Mike Gold, who later became my editor, he looked at me and said, hey, we might have something that's right up your alley. He said, can I send you a script to do some sample work on it? I said, sure. And so they sent me a script in the mail, and I FedExed the samples to him. And I was sitting at TSR Hobbies, my day job.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden the art director comes in, he says, hey Tim, you've got a call from some publisher named First Comics in my office. So I had to take the call in my art director's office, and they were offering me like the chance to be an artist. I said, sure, I'll do it.
Yeah, right.
In the office. And so I quit TSR.
You put in your 2 weeks notice right then, too.
Pretty much.
Oh, wow.
Was the case.
Very cool. So how important was that character, Grimjack, for you?
He He launched my entire career. It started out as a backup, like 8-page backup story in a book called Star Slayer,
Okay.
which was done by a guy who's now a good friend of mine, Mike Grill. And the backup series became as popular, if not more popular, than the lead series. And so it went for a few issues, and the response was so overwhelming that they said, hey, we got to launch Grimjack as its own book. And sure enough, they did that. Grimjack became its own title. But the guys liked my work so much. Somewhere during the course of that, I'd also became the artist for the Star Slayer comic. So I was doing Star Slayer lead feature plus the Grimjack backup feature. So it was a full book. And they liked the work I was doing on both titles. So whenever they offered for Grimjack to become its own book, they said, hey, we want you to keep drawing the Star Slayer book as well. And I was like, man, that's a lot of work. And then the other side of me was going, hey, man, that's a lot of work. So, the good side and the bad side of it. I might do things a little differently if I had to do it over again, because drawing 2 books, I was penciling and inking both books. And sometimes penciling and inking as many as 5 pages a day, which is just, it's an astronomical amount of work. These days it'll take me 2 days to pencil a page and 2 days to ink a page. I just take more time. So, I really jumped into the fire. So I hate to look at that old work because it is bashed out.
Yeah, okay.
It's not as detailed as the work I do.
So then you eventually transitioned to DC, right? Didn't you do work with Hawkman?
Yeah, it's after Grimjack, I got a chance to do my own creator-owned title, which was Scout. So I did that for, I don't know, 5 years, something like that. Also with the same publisher, I launched a thing we called it the Four Winds Publishing Group. So we packaged comic titles for this publisher. I started meeting a lot of really great writers and illustrators at comic book conventions, and so we would package, a friend and I, Chuck Dixon, would package like comic book concepts, and we would sell them to Eclipse, and then Eclipse would publish them. So we had 4 titles plus Scout going at one point. We later launched into publishing our own graphic novels. And so, I would be drawing Scout, which was, I was writing, penciling, inking, and doing covers for Scout. I was editing about 4 books, and then I was trying to run my own graphic novel publishing company. Yeah. And it got to be a bit much work. So a friend who was working, actually it was Mike Gold, who'd been my editor at First Comics. He started working with DC, and he made a phone call and wanted to see if I would be interested in revamping Hawkman. Yeah. And so I said, yeah, sure. Yeah. Because it was better money than I was making, and I'd be able to slow my pace down a little bit. Okay. I was just writing and penciling it, and then there was an inker from Argentina who was going to be inking it. So the pace was easier, the money was about as good, and so that's how I started working with DC.
Is Scout your most important character to you?
To me.
Yeah, okay, I would think.
He's just, when I was growing up, I didn't know if I wanted to be a writer, an artist, or a musician. And at least Scout gave me the ability to sort of meet 2 of those goals. I was a writer and an artist, and I was creating my own concepts, which I'd been doing for years and years, but just as sort of a sideline. But it was my real chance to kind of branch out and do my own.
Yeah. Where'd the inspiration for Scout come from?
I've always been sort of a history buff, and at that point I was getting really into Native American culture and history, both modern and, sort of in the historical sense. And I've gotten totally enamored by Apache culture, southwestern Apache culture. I've gone to visit a friend, and this was when I was doing Grimjack, and he said, Tim, if you could do your own comics, your own concept, what would you do? I'd say, well, I'd do a science fiction story about an Apache riding a motorcycle. Just popped in my head. And somehow that whole idea caught fire, and I couldn't get it out of my brain. So I was visiting another friend in California a few months later, and we had a chance to have dinner with Cat Ironwood and Dean Mullaney, who were the publishers at Eclipse Comics. And they asked me if I'd like to do a book for them. And I said, sure. And they said, what would you think you'd want to do? And I said, well, how about a story about a science fiction story about an Apache riding a motorcycle? So they wanted to see the pitch on that.
You also get into some Western themes.
Mm-hmm.
So what drew you to that genre? Is that, again, with the history?
Yeah, both the history and then also just my natural affinity for the subject matter. Say when I was a kid, that's what I watched on TV, was, the Westerns. And then in high school and college, we had these old movie houses where you could go watch like 3 movies for $1, and any B Western that would come out, I would go see it. And so I just loved the genre. I didn't like reading Western books, but I loved watching Western TV shows and movies.
I never knew you got into the rock and roll end of things until my editor mentioned that you did some work with the Grateful Dead and the Grateful Dead comics as well. How did that come about?
I would go to these head shops and I would pick up underground comics. I wasn't into like drugs, I just wanted their comics.
Yeah.
Kitchen Sink. They were doing the Grateful Dead comics at the time. I called them. They said, sure, Tim, we'll get back in touch with you in a couple of days, and you can we'll let you know where to send the portfolio. Art director called back a few minutes later, and he said, hey, there's no need to send your portfolio. Jerry Garcia knows your work. And I come to find out that Garcia was a huge comic book collector, and he had been following my Scout comics. In 1991, I started working with the Grateful Dead, and I'm still working with them. I mean, I've done T-shirts and CD covers. I do a one-page cartoon for the Grateful Dead Almanac where I sort of adapt Robert Hunter's lyrics.
Yeah, which shirts and which CD covers?
I did from 93 to 95, the year Jerry died. I did about 5 or 6 T-shirts for various tours. What they would have me to do is, at that point, the Grateful Dead was doing specific shirts for specific venues, and so I did a couple of Winterland shirts. I did a Chinese New Year shirt. I did a Flying Bullfrog for like the southern leg of their tour. I did a Flying Bullfrog T-shirt. I did 2 CD covers for the Dead and one for Hot Tuna. Whenever the Grateful Dead was handling their own stuff, now that Rhino Records is handling their stuff, I did the cover for Live at the Cow Palace. And in 2013, I did. They have the Dave's Picks series of live shows.
Yeah.
I did 5 covers for that year of releases. Then most recently, the band wanted me to kick off their. They're doing a limited edition vinyl singles subscription thing, and they're taking all their singles in chronological order, and I think the whole project is going to take about 7 years to do them all, but they wanted me to kick off the first one.
Are you a fan of the music?
Yeah, especially the early stuff, like 69 to 72, that's when maybe 73, that's what I tend to listen to most, especially sort of that Working Man's Dead, the Skull and Roses album, Europe 72, that period where they were kind of country rock, but we're kind of mixing it with these. Lots
of Americana in there.
Yeah. That's what I really like. That's my favorite stuff.
You also did work on Star Wars comics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Tell me about that. I didn't know about that.
I worked on those for about 2.5 years.
Okay.
That's another thing where an editor just called me up and said, "Hey, would you be interested in writing some Star Wars stuff?" And I said, "Sure." Actually, I think the way it kicked off was it was around the time of Episode 1. They wanted me to do sort of a little prequel sequence to the movie, which I did, and I just wrote it. I didn't draw it. They liked the work so much that they offered me a job doing the regular, the monthly Star Wars comic. And on top of that, they had me to write and draw, because of my reputation with Grimjack and all this. There was this character, R.S. Singh, who'd appeared in Episode 1, just as a little side character. They wanted me to sort of flesh out her background and do a comic book about her. She was one of the bounty hunters.
Okay.
And so I did an R.S. Singh comic, and then I ended up writing what became sort of the Bible for the character. Even though they never used her in any other films, they would have people develop some of these side characters. I was one of the few writers that never had to do any revisions for my stories.
Oh, wow.
I would thoroughly research all of the characters. I handled the Star Wars stuff as if it was actual historical material.
You want to go into the studio?
Yeah.
It's the messy studio. And computer.
How long you been working out of here?
I used to work downstairs in the basement. Had a big room down there, and there's very little light down there. So after the kids graduated, I wanted to get up into the light, so I moved everything up here. Yeah, this is where I do most of my work. These days, about half of it's done on the computer and half actual on the board. I make figure models on the computer. I have a modeling program, so it's like having your own model, except you don't have to pay them. And so I sort of compose things on the computer, and then I print them out, and then I'll ink them on just regular. I love the feel of. I love working on the computer, especially painting, but also when I'm doing my black and white work. I like to, I just love the feel of paper and the drag of my brush across the paper. When you're working on trying to do that on the computer screen, like I've got a drawing monitor, so I can take a stylus and I can actually draw, paint or draw on the screen if I wanted to. But it's a lot like drawing on a window.
Okay.
And so I usually just do my color that way, and I love to color on the computer. But when I do black and white work, which I can show you some of, I like to do it the traditional way.
What are you working on now?
Besides putting together a couple books that actually Kat is helping me design, sort of retrospectives of my illustration career. A lot of, I work in comics, but most comic fans don't realize how much illustration work I've done for role-playing games, for book covers, for magazine covers. And then they also haven't seen, most of the comics fans haven't seen my rock and roll work.
Yeah.
And it looks like of all the artists that have been affiliated with the Grateful Dead, I've probably done the most actual artwork for them. So, besides them, I've also worked with Jim Lauderdale, who's a Nashville guy. Hot Tuna. I did a big box set for Sony Music that featured the work of my favorite guitar player in the world, who was Rory Gallagher, who was an Irish blues player. And so I did this really great big project for him. So it looks like I'll be putting together a 200-page book of my sort of book and magazine illustrations, and then the rock and roll book will probably be about 175 to 200 pages. And so it'll be 2 different volumes. And focusing on my illustration career. So right now what I'm doing is I just got an assignment to do for a children's book publisher to do monsters of the Greek myths. So I'm doing drawing 8 of the mythical Greek monsters, you know, Medusa and the centaurs and Chimera and all that stuff, which is going to be a blast, you know. And previously I had done about 8 different full color plates for a adaptation of Beowulf for them. So
cool.
They liked working with me so much that they asked me to do these Greek myths, you know. Yeah, here's some of the stuff I've done. Grateful Dead single cover that I was talking about. When I got this, it was for what show? Let's see, Atlanta. And they said, they told me the show and they said, and don't do any Civil War stuff. And I said, I was like, oh man, I had a totally great idea for something. I said, at least let me send you the sketch. And so when they saw the sketch of this, they loved it. It was like, you know, I have blue and gray guys, and it's after the war or after the battle, and they're like living it up, playing music. Everybody's getting along great, you know. Despite their misgivings about doing Civil War subject matter, this pick here was used as the top of a guitar that Alvarez guitarists did for their Grateful Dead's 50th anniversary. I'm really proud of this one. This was a Grateful Dead live at the Cow Palace, New Year's '76. And it was fun working with them on this one. Because I got to do the interior artwork. It's the cow of the previous year, and then this is the calf of the new year, which they liked. There's a nice sort of full view of it. I really enjoyed doing this one. It was, I mentioned Rory Gallagher, who's my favorite Irish blues guitarist, and Rory had done, he passed away in '95. So there have been various collections of his work that have come out, and this one I was contacted by, I'd actually had Rory doing a cameo in my comic book Grimjack way back in the '80s. Rory was really involved in film noir and detective stories. And he had written, I didn't even realize it until I saw the list of songs, he'd written about 50 songs that have that sort of theme, like crime or detectives or secret agents or whatever, you know, have really film noir themes. So Donald had the great idea to do a collection of those songs and to also have Ian Rankin, who's a famous, I think he's Scottish novelist, detective novelist. He did this little short story. So we did, we put together this book that's in this box set that has like a little pulp story in it, you know, detective story that Ian Rankin wrote. And this is my favorite illustration from it. But anyway, it's just like one of the old dime detective pulps from the 30s, and you know, fully illustrated, and all the songs, or all the songs that are covered in the box set, there's little touchstones either lyrically or through the titles throughout the story. There's little touchstones for those various songs, and so it was a fantastic project. So there's a collection of the songs themselves, a live show, and then Aidan Quinn, the actor Aidan Quinn, he reads. There's a CD of Aidan Quinn doing a dramatization of the story, reading the story. So there's like a little audio book in here too. So it's just fantastic. And what was really cool about it is, you know, you had a comic book art. Usually whenever somebody does a tribute, you'll have like all these musicians to get together and cover the songs. This was like a tribute by people who really loved and appreciated Rory's music, and we were drawn from outside the music industry. You know, you had Ian Rankin, who's a novelist, me, who's a comic book artist and illustrator, and then you had Aidan Quinn, who's an actor, and we were all crazy about Rory's music. And so we got together with this and came out into a really nice package. It got a couple of awards in Europe from various blues societies and music societies. So. But it was just fantastic being a part of it, because like I say, I'm a total fan for Rory's stuff, more so than the Grateful Dead, actually. It's more up my alley, you know, like blues rock stuff. So.